Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on the final stretch, even more tips for obligating your ARP-HCY funds before the September 30th, 2024 deadline. I am so glad that you've joined us today. My name is Erin Patterson. I'm the Director of Education Initiatives at Schoolhouse Connection, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Karen Rice, Anna Sophia Treyes, and Barbara Duffield, our Executive Director. We have a lot of great stuff to share with you today. We hope to answer your questions as well. So let's get started. Before we dive in, just a few housekeeping and logistics notes. Today's webinar will last 1 hour and 15 minutes. We ask that you type your questions into the Q&A box. That's where we'll look to see what we need to answer. We always do our best to answer every question that is sent into us during the webinar. And you can ask any question at any time that it comes up throughout today's session in that Q&A box. This session is also being recorded, and you will be able to access a link to the recording on our archived webinars page at schoolhouseconnection.org. And you will also receive a copy and a follow-up email along with the slides. We'll be sure to share the slides with you today as well. A little bit about Schoolhouse Connection, if you're not familiar, we're so glad you joined us today. We are a national nonprofit advocacy organization, and our mission is overcoming homelessness through education, from prenatal to post-secondary. And we work at that in a number of different ways, including a lot of practical assistance to K-12 school districts, state education agencies, early childhood programs, institutions of higher education, and others. We also engage in policy advocacy at the federal and state levels. And we always say the jewel in our crown is our network of young scholars, whom we are privileged to support through both financial scholarship assistance, as well as case management and other wraparound services. We encourage you to check out our website, schoolhouseconnection.org. Chances are, if you have a question about something, someone else has likely already asked it, and we post those answers anonymously on our website. You can find that resource, which is titled Q&A from our inbox. And you'll also have the opportunity to sign up for our e-news and receive regular updates from us. Before we dive into our content for today, I'm going to launch a poll so that we can get a sense of who is in the virtual room with us here today. So hopefully you can see this on your screen. There are two questions we'd love to know the answer to. The first one is asking, does your school district have unspent ARP-HCY funds? And then the next question, if you answered yes to that question, roughly how much remains? And you can choose one of those amount bands there. So I'm going to give it a couple seconds to give folks time to think and respond, and I'll let you know before we close it out. And it looks like we've got a little over half of respondents who have locked in your answers. Thank you so much. I'll give folks another couple seconds to process and respond. And we have almost 3/4 of you who have sent in your responses. We're almost there. I'll give it another couple seconds. Looks like folks are still locking in. Okay. Looks like anyone who wants to respond has had the opportunity. So I'm going to end our poll here and share these results. And hopefully you can see on your screen, it looks like about 75% of you on this webinar today said, yes, you do have unspent ARP-HCY funds. A few of you don't. A couple say you don't know. That's understandable. I know we have a lot of new liaisons out there in the world, or maybe you weren't in those conversations in your district. And then a few of you said not applicable. Maybe your district did not accept your ARP-HCY funds. Maybe you were a really small district. Of those who said yes, you do have unspent funds. This is pretty even across here, similar to what we saw in our last webinar a few weeks ago. Pretty even spread between less than 5,000, between 5 and 10,000, and between 10 and 20,000. So the majority of you have between 5 and 20,000 left to spend. A fair percentage of you, 15%, have between 20 and 50K. And then a couple of you, 11%, have more than $50,000 left to spend. So that's great. We're so glad you're here today. That means you have it and you are looking for ways to use it before that September 30th obligation deadline. So I'm going to stop sharing our poll here. Thank you so much. That's super helpful to us. We're going to get into some strategies a little bit later. Even on September 4th, there are still things you can do between now and September 30th to get those funds obligated, and we want to give you as many ideas as possible. Before we dive into those strategies, we want to do a quick overview of our timeline. Where are we now? It feels like the days and hours and minutes are ticking by, and so we want to make sure that you all have the information you need about what has to happen and when you can do certain things with these ARP-HCY funds. So we developed a resource for reviewing your timeline, reviewing the American Rescue Plan Homeless Children and Youth timeline. You'll see the link in these slides where you can download that. And I think one of my colleagues will be able to put the link in the chat as well if you'd like to go ahead and access it now. We tried to make this as digestible and actionable as possible. And so I want to review some of those benchmark timings from here until the end. So by September 30th of 2024, by 26 days from now, ARP-HCY funds must be obligated. And one question we receive a lot is, what does that mean, obligated? That means that there is a binding written commitment, a contract to obtain services, work, or products. So that would be an executed contract or a purchase order, for example, that are in place in order for those funds to be considered obligated by September 30th. So that means that between now and September 30th, you don't have to have the services rendered. You just have to have a contract in place stating that those services will take place. As long as that contract is written and signed by September 30th, then your funds will be considered obligated. Beyond September 30th, you have your liquidation deadline. Liquidation is set at the federal level about 120 days after obligation. That means that by January 28th of 2025, ARP-HCY funds must be liquidated. And liquidated means they do have to be spent, or all receipts of purchases have been reimbursed. There are a few exceptions, excuse me. For example, if your state or LEA has issued an earlier liquidation deadline, then please abide by your state's earlier liquidation deadline. I know some states have set a liquidation deadline, for example, of December 30th. And so you want to pay attention and be in touch with your state coordinator and your state education agency to make sure you understand what your state's liquidation deadline is. The other exception is your state might apply to the U.S. Department of Education for a process called extended liquidation. And if that's true, then your deadline to liquidate funds is March 30th of 2026. You have a much longer runway to liquidate those funds. The important part being those funds still must be obligated by September 30th. So these next couple of weeks will be critical for obligating funds. And again, encourage you to check in with your state coordinator and your state education agency to determine if you are under an earlier liquidation deadline or if you are eligible for extended liquidation in your state. I know a number of states have already taken advantage of that application process. We also know that on extended liquidation in February of this year, the U.S. Department of Education made this announcement that states can apply for extended liquidation. We want to note here, we get this question a lot, local education agencies, LEAs, may not individually apply. You have to go through your state. So if your state has chosen to apply for extended liquidation, you should be receiving communication from your state coordinator about what that process looks like, what they need from you, and then your state will apply on your behalf to the U.S. Department of Education. So again, very important to be in the loop with your state education agency. And again, like we mentioned on the last slide, if approved, your state and local education agencies would have an additional 14 months. So that January 28th, 2025 liquidation deadline would no longer apply to you. You would have until March of 2026 if you are eligible for extended liquidation. So perhaps if you are on this webinar today, one quick action step, one quick thing you can do while we're sitting here is email your state coordinator or look for that information on your state education agency's website if you are not already aware that they are applying for extended liquidation. And with that, I will turn it over to Barbara.
Thank you very much, Erin. So very quickly, we want to go through some recent clarifications about the use of ARP-HCY funds during and after the liquidation period. So this will be important to think about when Karen and Anna Sophia go through some examples. Depending on how much money you have, it will be important to keep this timeline for specific uses of funds in mind. So there are some items that if they are purchased by September 30th, they may be used or distributed after the liquidation period. So again, they have to be purchased by September 30th, but then they could be used after. Some examples of those include store cards or prepaid debit cards, gas cards, bus tickets, laundry tokens, supplies, and equipment. So so even if your state doesn't apply for extended liquidation, these are the items that can be used after September 30th. The U.S. Department of Education has emphasized with respect to things like store cards, gas cards, bus tickets, et cetera, that the amount purchased should be based on recent data on the number of students who are homeless, including recent trends, identification efforts, if you're planning to increase by 10%, for example, and those costs. They also strongly encourage and require strong internal controls about tracking. We'll get into that a little bit later as well. So that's some information about what items can be used after the liquidation deadline. And on the next slide, we talk a little bit about services. So these are the sorts of contracted services that can continue after September 30th, and they can last until the end of the liquidation period. That might be in December, it might be January, or in the cases of extended liquidation, it would be March of 26. So examples of those sorts of contracted services: transportation, so third-party transportation providers, staffing capacity at community-based organizations, after-school programming, training and professional development, licenses and subscriptions, so thinking about telehealth, cell phone contracts, things along those lines, and then short-term housing placements, so like the motels, for example, if they're provided through a contract with a community-based organization or another LEA, and we'll say more about that in a second. So again, just to sort of like think about the range of contracted services that if you hurry and get a contract by September 30th, could continue until the end of liquidation. And on the next slide, thinking about the category of contracts or services or activities that are not permitted beyond September 30th. So the big one here is staff salaries. Neither SEA nor LEA staff salaries can be drawn down during liquidation. So that has to be September 30th. However, if you have contracted salaries, so contractor salaries, those may be provided during the liquidation period, and they also can be provided while the state's awaiting to see if it's approved for extended liquidation. The department has also said that SEAs or LEAs can actually contract with another LEA to provide services past the deadline. The other big category that is prohibited beyond September 30th is travel expenses. So things like airfare and lodging. So you can use the funds to pay for a conference registration for a conference that's happening after September 30th, but you can't use the funds to get there or for a hotel. So those are the big kind of prohibited pieces. And then I think lastly, continuation on that. The other one that is a little bit convoluted, so we provided a little bit more information here. So because the Code of Federal Regulations consider funds to be obligated when property is used, the Department of Education has said that an SEA or LEA can't contract with the motel directly to prepay rooms after September 30th. But what they could do is contract with the CBO or another LEA for students experiencing homelessness, since that's considered to be a service. So we put the fine print. For most of these, we have a link to the fine print. So if somebody wants to see chapter and verse, and you can show where it says that the Department of Education said that. For this one, we put the fine print right on the slide because again, it's a little bit confusing. And last piece, actually, and this one I think is really important as you're thinking about what to sustain. What you can spend now that you might be able to sustain either with McKinney-Vento if you get a subgrant or with your Title I Part A set aside. So firstly, all of the uses of ARP-HCY, all of those broad uses, the department has clarified that you can do those same things with your McKinney-Vento subgrants with the exception of short-term motel stays. That is the one piece that is not carrying over per the U.S. Department of Education. We are continuing to advocate for that, and we've had some success in recent appropriations bills, but for right now, that's the one use that doesn't carry over. The other piece that's clarified that's really important to think about, even if you don't get a McKinney-Vento subgrant, is use of Title I Part A. Again, there's a required Title set aside under Title I Part A for homeless students, and those funds can be used for many of the allowable activities. Specifically, we have clarification about store cards, gas cards, and limited car repairs, subject to the same principles that always apply to using Title I Part A for students who are homeless. First, that the services are reasonable and necessary to assist students to participate in an educational opportunity. And second, as a last resort when funds or services aren't otherwise available from public or private sources. So that's kind of a summary of the clarifications regarding how the timeline and the uses of funds overlap. And I think we're stopping now for some questions before we move on to, we'll want to pause here and take some questions specifically about that. And then Anna, Sophie, and Karen are going to give you some great ideas, including thinking about how much money you have left and what you could do.
And I'll put in a plug here. We have shared some resources in the chat, so please do keep up with those links. They're all on our website. We have an ARP-HCY section on our website. Did want to pause here in case there are any questions. Those are a lot of sort of nuanced in the weeds clarifications, and so want to make sure we are giving you all of the opportunities to ask any questions that you might have. Seeing none, I will move us on, and I'm going to turn it over to, I think Karen Rice is going to start us off with our first couple of strategies. Again, encourage you all as you're listening to put any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we'll come back to pause for questions in a few minutes.
All right, well, let's start by talking about transportation, because we know that this is an important need. It's a significant need for our students. And so want to just talk through an example that is a higher cost amount as well as a lower cost amount. So just to give you a couple of examples on how you could use funds to meet this need. Thinking through the higher cost, purchasing a vehicle is a great way to meet student needs. It's a great way to make sure that you have transportation specific for your students experiencing homelessness, thinking through how it might take a bit more time to set up a bus route or to figure out alternative transportation. Having a vehicle at your disposal means you can get students to school right away and not have to wait for those bus routes or things like that. And so want to just give you an example of a district in Wisconsin. The Eau Claire Area School District was featured on a webinar that we did earlier in the spring, and they purchased a vehicle with their ARP-HCY funds, including in having a driver that was at their disposal to use that vehicle to pick up children and youth experiencing homelessness in their LEA. And that driver went through some training with the homeless liaison in that district to really act as a liaison between families and the homeless liaison in the district. And so when that driver learned that families had moved or needed resources from school, the driver was also able to deliver that and pass messages along. And it really helped to facilitate that connection with families. And the vehicle purchase helped them to be able to get children and youth to school quickly and efficiently right away so that they were in class and not having to wait for those bus routes or to make arrangements with taxi services and things like that. So that was a higher cost item that they purchased with their funds. And then thinking, of course, of how to sustain that and working with your transportation department will be really critical in thinking through and making that purchase with your funds. And then on the lower cost side of that, one idea is to purchase bikes for students. And so we typically hear questions about students who are in walk zones and how it's still a struggle sometimes for students to get to school in those walk zones. And so purchasing bikes can be a great way to help meet some of those needs. So again, another example of an LEA that did this, New Philadelphia City Schools in Ohio had a group of students within the walk zone that were struggling to get to school. And they were talking and thinking through ways that they could help kind of facilitate that, knowing that they didn't have the transportation options within their walk zone, and there was not an extenuating circumstance to provide transportation within that walk zone. So they purchased bikes for students, and they found that those students were able to connect with other students who were riding bikes to school. It helped them to get to school more quickly, and it increased their attendance just by having access to that bike to support their attendance. So that's on the lower cost side of things that you could do to meet that transportation need. And then on the next slide, just a couple of quick examples around identification and outreach. Again, thinking through kind of how we can have those different cost amounts. A couple of examples, knowing that many of us are back in school and or starting school very soon, that we really need to think about how we're identifying students and how we're connecting with students and families for that purpose of identification. So thinking through different stipends or extended contract hours that you could use for social workers or others in your LEA that are working with students to really help facilitate that identification and making sure that services are provided and starting right away. So another example, the Minneapolis Public Schools provided stipends for their social workers to increase their social work time at the start of the school year to help meet with families to re-identify their students and arrange those services quickly and efficiently to get them in school as soon as possible, as close to the start of the year as possible. So thinking through maybe who in your LEA has some extra hours in their time or would be willing to do some extended contract hours to really put in that time to connect with families and make sure that students are identified and have all the services and supports they need at this beginning of the school year time. Another maybe higher cost way to spend your funds when it comes to identification and outreach is to think through different public service announcements or awareness campaigns that you could do in your community. So again, another example in Dayton, Ohio, their public schools did a billboard campaign with 10 billboards around the city and has radio spots on local radio stations that families listen to. And this is really a way for them to increase their awareness in their community and with their families about McKinney-Vento and what that is and how to connect back to schools for services. So thinking through just different ways that you can let the community and families more broadly within the community know about McKinney-Vento, again, to increase that identification. And with that, I will turn it over to Anna Sophia.
Great, thank you, Karen. Yeah, so I looked at the poll and it seemed like there was a good amount of you that seemed to have medium or lower cost needs. Seems like you have a smaller amount of funds there. So I want to just focus on a couple of examples. So in the supplies category, thinking about how to leverage store cards and prepaid debit cards. So we actually did a webinar with the McKinney-Vento liaison from the Greece City School District in New York State. I think earlier last fall, and she specifically mentioned that she was able to purchase store cards in partnership with a local laundromat. And so it's a little store card that has a code on it, and families are able to upload that into an app, and then they're able to do loads of laundry in their own time without having to go to a school laundromat. So it kind of helps with that autonomy, but also just a good way to use local partnerships. And of course, on the lower end, thinking about things like stipends and extended contract hours, especially if you happen to have a way to perhaps enter a contract with a community-based organization to help with the distribution or purchasing of supplies, that might be another way to think about that as well. And then again, thinking about food, so thinking about kind of a lower cost strategy. We just recently hosted a webinar, I think a few weeks ago, with the liaison from the Clifton Public Schools in New Jersey. And she specifically mentioned that she leveraged store cards for her families that were staying in shelter. So thinking about families in shelters may not have availability to make their own meals. And so she was able to purchase store cards for restaurant providers in the area of the shelters. That really helped with families who don't have the ability to cook their own meals. And again, if you're interested in learning more about that, we did just host a webinar about that, and it is available on our archived webinars. And then again, thinking about medium and higher cost options, thinking about that contracting piece. The McKinney-Vento liaison from Bridgeport Public Schools was able to partner with a local nonprofit that's able to provide food services when there's no school meals readily available. So thinking about weekends, thinking about those long breaks from school, they're able to kind of fill that gap. So again, just another thing to think about, and partnering with local nonprofits as a strategy. And then lastly, I will just cover a couple examples around technology. So 2 examples are from a district in Alaska and one in New York. So Many districts have been able to purchase cell phones. In these two districts, they specifically purchased them for their unaccompanied homeless youth, and were able to load those cell phones with different applications and things to help meet unaccompanied homeless youth meet their basic needs. And then the district in New York in particular was also able to provide Visa store cards for any of those students who may be on an existing phone plan. And so they were able to use that phone bill as a receipt and then provide Visa gift cards so the students can pay a portion of their bills. So again, just another strategy to think about. We like a sustainable approach here. So thinking about those supplies that can be used after the obligation deadline is a really great strategy as well.
Thank you both so much. We've had a number of questions come in, so I want to encourage participants to continue submitting your questions. And there are a couple that we'll take. I do want to direct your attention. I'm not sure if our participants can see the answered questions, but we have already addressed a few. And so just want to speak some of those into our virtual space here. A question about prepaying for nights at a hotel. One person shared they have prepaid 10 nights at a hotel for emergency stays. And we just wanted to clarify that those stays then must be used by September 30th, because that's when the obligation has to happen, and hotel stays are obligated when the stay happens. And so if you have prepaid nights at a hotel or motel, you still have a few weeks to use those. So, and if you have a lot of funds left, or even a little bit of funds left, that could be a way to use those funds between now and September 30th, as long as those nights are used by September 30th. Another question about store cards and when they have to be used if you've already purchased them. We put a note here that says, per the federal rules, store cards can continue past your liquidation deadline, but not beyond 4 years after obligation. So if your state, for example, is not applying for extended liquidation, and you must have things liquidated by January of 2025, you can still use those purchased store cards beyond that January 2025 liquidation deadline. Again, we encourage you to check in with your state. Some states have set parameters around how long past the liquidation deadline you can use those store cards, but we want to assure you that if you purchase store cards in bulk now, you can continue using those even if you are not taking advantage of extended liquidation. And then we had another question, of a transportation related question. Would a contract with Uber or Lyft be allowed? And in fact, yes, some LEAs are doing just that. We encourage you to check with your LEA in terms of what's allowed and what's not. And there are a couple education specific transportation providers like Hop, Skip, Drive or Everdriven who might be able to meet those needs. So wanted to make sure everyone is able to see those responses. And now we want to get into some questions, some additional questions. Let's stick with the transportation theme here. We have a question that says, how would you address using a third-party provider in transportation and elementary age children? Parents want to accompany the children, but are they allowed to be driven back to their residence? That's a great question. We receive this one fairly frequently. Again, encourage you to check with your LEA and your administration and your rules and processes. Some districts have been successful in saying, yes, that expense is allowable, and that that Uber, that Everdriven, whatever the arrangement is, can be used to bring both the parent and child to the school and then return the parent either to home or to work. Certainly there is a strong case that if that parent cannot get to their final destination, then the child will not be at school that day. And that's the most important thing, removing those barriers to help the child access school. So we definitely would encourage you to check with your administration, but we would be happy to point you to some examples of districts who have been successful in doing that. Another question says, are we able to purchase laptops for graduating students experiencing homelessness as a support for post-secondary, or is this considered a gift of public funds? We have gotten this question often and want to open it up to my colleagues, but I'll start by saying that if the student has not graduated yet, there's certainly a stronger case to be made for purchasing that laptop, particularly if it will help them complete their high school coursework, and invite any of my other Schoolhouse colleagues to weigh in on that.
I would absolutely agree with that, and just add that at this point, with the start of a new school year, that laptop could be used not only for their educational purposes, but also to do some of those college readiness activities, completing the FAFSA, filling out college applications, things like that. So purchasing that at this point in the year, at the beginning of the year, is a great resource for that student to have for all of those things that go into moving on into their post-secondary plans.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm going to move on to our next question that says, we were going to use our small amount of money to purchase additional socks and clothes. Sorry, my screen's moving here. We're going to use our small amount of money to purchase additional socks and underclothes, etc., for the clothing closet that we have for the district. Is it correct that we have to have those out to students by March of next year? It is not a lot of money, but they are supplies that we definitely always use for, quote, immediate clothing needs when we have students come in with nothing. What do you think? So team, I'm going to punt this one to you all. What do you think about that timeline?
So supplies, things that fall in the category of supplies don't actually have a deadline. If you read the fine print, what the fine print said, supplies and equipment, as long as they're being used consistent with the purposes of either ARP-HCY or a similar federal program like Title I, like AHCY, they can continue to be used. So you can absolutely do that. You can absolutely stock your supplies and have them available as needs come up.
Okay, our next question. If we use money to provide snacks for back to school events, how do we specify that only McKinney-Vento students are able to get the snack? Our district has a food pantry for needy families, but again, we haven't used this money to help with that due to documentation of use for only McKinney-Vento. So I'll open this one up to our team as well.
I can jump in with this. I would say if you have a food pantry that is open to all families, I would continue to have your McKinney-Vento families using that food pantry, and then think about other ways that you could provide food and snacks specifically for your McKinney-Vento students. And so whether that's having separate snacks in the liaison's office or in a point of contact's office for students to access during the day, or having separate snacks for students who are identified under McKinney-Vento to access for extracurricular activities. Those food needs will be there at various points during the day. And at various points, with students that are going home and might need snacks and things like that. So I would look at other ways that you could use your funds to provide snacks specifically for those students. I do agree that it would be very difficult to document when you have families coming in and out, although there might be opportunities to connect with new families who share their living situations in those moments. But I would think through other ways that you could use your funds for those food needs apart from the food pantry.
I can just jump in here too as well, which is just, we've had this question come up with a lot of districts who have been trying to implement some sort of food pantry or community care closet. And so thinking about that stigma piece in the law, so you want to avoid stigma in any which way. So there's nothing that prevents you from having this open to all students. But again, we've heard of McKinney-Vento liaisons doing specific outreach for their McKinney-Vento families, whether that's a phone call to let them know this exists or some sort of document, a one-pager or something, just to let them know that this exists. So just making sure that you're thinking about that outreach piece as well.
Thank you both. I'm going to hop over to our chat. I realize some questions are coming in there as well. If you are able to put the questions in the Q&A box, that would be super helpful. That's where we're going primarily to answer your questions, but want to make sure I'm getting all those that have been submitted in the chat as well. So this question came in, how about a contract to repair facilities like showers? Can they be extended after 9/30, after September 30th, as long as the contract is signed by September 30th? So assuming the contract is signed and in place by that obligation deadline of September 30th, then yes, the liquidation period then goes through either January 28th of 2025, so you would have until then, or if you are in a district and state who is applying for and receiving extended liquidation, that contract could go beyond that through potentially March of 2026. Team, is there anything else, any other points on that one? Okay. The next question we received in our chat over here, to clarify, we can purchase Visa gift cards to help with our family's bills if needed. That's a clarification we got. So I want to open it up to our schoolhouse team to address that one.
I can launch this here just to reiterate kind of what I shared earlier, the example with the phone for the unaccompanied homeless youth. So again, just the general guiding principles of ARP-HCY funds is that it's reasonable and necessary and will support the academic achievement and attainment of students experiencing homelessness. And so in this case, the case that I mentioned a little bit earlier, unaccompanied youth were using this phone not only to connect with school, but also to connect to community partners. And so what they did was that they were on a bill for someone else was paying for that bill, and then they used that bill as a receipt. So they gave a student a Visa gift card, and then they had the receipt of how it was used. This is very district specific. Again, as we know with all these, it's very, very important that you just work with your school business officer just to determine what the best approach for that might be. It is allowable, but again, we know that every district has specific ways of doing that, and this is how one district was able to do it. So just want to highlight that in case it's helpful.
Awesome. I'm going to keep us moving through our questions here. These are great questions. Thank you all so much for submitting these. This is exactly how we hope to use this time. So please don't be shy. We've heard it all at this point, but if you can stump us, then we're open to it. Our next question says, if a bill comes from another school department for a share of transportation after September 30th, but the transportation was before September 30th, we can pay them, correct? However, if it is after that date, we can't pay for it with ARP funding since we don't have a contract, right? This is like one of those math word problems, and I have so much respect for liaisons who are doing this every single day. So giving our team time to pause and process, I'll open it up to see what the response is.
Well, I can jump in and just say that you may want to think about other funding sources to use for these transportation costs. I'm hoping that Barbara will weigh in on the timing of all of it. But thinking through, Title I, Part A, set aside funds and other funding sources that you could use to help with those transportation costs, just offering another way to fund what those costs as they come in.
Well, and what I'm looking at is I'm looking at that definition of liquidation in our PowerPoint to see if that can provide some clarity for us. Liquidation meaning funds being liquidated, means spent or all receipts of purchase reimbursed. So I'm wondering if something like that might be considered. So what we might do with this one is we might send out an answer afterwards just to be clarified. We don't give you the wrong answer, but I wonder about that particular piece. So it might be that if it's considered a reimbursement, then maybe that's something that could be paid it can be considered into the end of the liquidation period. One thing that we did just to mention, we did this webinar a couple of weeks ago. We got so many questions, we couldn't answer everything. And also there were some that we didn't want to answer on the spot because we didn't want to give the wrong answer. So we actually made a Q&A document for all of those. And so we can put that in the chat box as well. And this I think could be a good candidate for, this is what we think right now, but let us get back to you so we don't lead you astray.
Okay, keeping us moving here. It looks like this group today is really on the transportation train, which just thrills us to no end. We love answering questions about transportation. Just kidding. These are tricky scenarios, and we want to make sure we're giving you all the information possible. So this next question is, it came in just to us. We have a homeless student with disabilities who does not have a vehicle. Are we able to use our funds to help them to purchase a vehicle to use for school and doctor's appointments, or maybe look at contracting a vehicle for them to use for appointments that are far away? What do we think on this one, team?
I do not think that it's an allowable use of funds to purchase a vehicle for the family. I will say if they're able to come up with an option for purchasing their own vehicles, car repairs are allowable. And so just want to put in a plug, if you have not had a chance to listen to some of our previous webinars, we had a webinar this spring with Roanoke City Schools, where they talked about a partnership with their CTE program and how they were able to actually help connect families to affordable vehicles, not through the school, they were not school vehicles, but they helped facilitate some partnerships with others in the community, and then they were able to do the car repairs through their CTE program. And it was a partnership that the liaison developed with their CTE person. So no to the purchasing of the vehicle for the family, but just know that if you're able to help connect to them with someone else in the community and they are able to find their own vehicle, but it needs some repairs, that might be an option to use your funds to facilitate those repairs.
Okay, I'm going to keep us moving here. You all are sending some great questions. Going back to our Q&A box, and thank you all for submitting your questions. And going back to the issue of laptops, we had a question earlier asking if laptops could be purchased that students would then use in their post-secondary career. And remember, we had said certainly if the student is still enrolled in high school and they need the laptop in order to complete their high school coursework, then yes, we would absolutely make a case for that. This follow-up question says, are students allowed to keep the laptops given in order to complete high school? I'm assuming once they graduate high school. So I'm going to lean on my team here. I would imagine, well, let me lean on my team here for this answer.
So this is one where we actually did ask the U.S. Department of Education. We got this exact same question in the last webinar, and we actually weren't able to find a definitive answer. We know that you can buy devices for students. We know that you can provide them during the school year as long as they haven't graduated yet. But we didn't actually get a definitive yes, they can take them with them, or no, they can't. So that one is we're actually waiting for a question, an official answer from the U.S. Department of Ed.
Okay, I'm gonna keep us moving here. Lots of great questions coming in. Wondering how other districts are managing and dispersing fast food or restaurant gift cards for families that aren't able to make use of grocery gift cards due to living on the street or in their car. How much, in other words, the amount in each fast food restaurant gift card is each student given, and how often? So we would love for our participants to reply to that if you have examples of how you're doing that in your district. This is a great question in terms of amount, which can vary district to district and student to student, and would love to open it up to our team for any other examples that you all are aware of for this restaurant gift card piece.
I think unfortunately this is one of those questions, there's not a one size fits all. So it really kind of depends on what you're seeing in your district and what needs emerge. This conversation we actually had with the liaison from the Clifton Public Schools in that webinar that I mentioned earlier around store cards. And so in her district, what they did is they developed a system with her school business office where they would track the distribution. They started with a small amount of gift cards, and then they would track how many they were giving out and what the need was. And so that was one way that they were able to do that. I know that we're getting really close to the obligation deadline, so we don't have the luxury of time on our side. But just thinking about maybe purchasing a small amount and then increasing is one way to do that. But again, it just kind of depends on what you're seeing. And of course, we recommend that you just check in with families and do kind of a needs assessment before you go ahead and purchase a large amount.
Thank you very much, Anna Sophia. I'm gonna keep us moving here. The next question says, are we able to purchase yearbooks, dance, or grad night tickets? In general, we think yes, you can certainly use funds to purchase anything that helps our students experiencing homelessness experience school. And that certainly means yearbooks, dances, grad night tickets, graduation gown, cap, graduation fees, those sorts of things. You can certainly use your funds to purchase those items. Anything else to say there? Our next question. We are looking to contract for translation services by using ARP-HCY funds for an annual fee. Would this be something that is required to be liquidated prior to that liquidation or liquidation extension date? This is a great question. And so I'm gonna invite our team in, but we have received some clarification, and I think we speak to it in one of our documents around subscriptions. And so encourage you that if this is a subscription or can be noted as a subscription, then that changes, and you can certainly utilize that subscription service post liquidation. But I think someone on my team can probably say that much more eloquently.
Can't really improve on that. With this one, we did get a good, clear answer from the U.S. Department of Education, which is that, again, provided a contract is signed by September 30th, the invoice can be paid with ARP-HCY funds during the liquidation period, and the licensor's subscription may extend beyond the liquidation period. So those sorts of examples of those subscriptions or licenses, you gave a great one with translation, might also be cell phone, might also be telehealth services. So a good, clear answer.
Okay, we love this next question. Can we work with a community partner like the United Way to move funds into an account that will be earmarked for McKinney-Vento students? There will be a contract in place and records will be kept of funds. Will the money be considered used when we transfer money to United Way? This is a great question, and certainly encourage you to stick to your dates that we've reviewed, your obligation deadline. So if you are to enter into a contract, make sure it is by September 30th of this year. And then checking in with your district and state on whether or not liquidation or extended liquidation applies. I want to open it up to our team for other interpretations that I might be missing, but we really love this idea.
I would just add that another organization that you might consider setting up a contract with is if your LEA has an education foundation. We have talked to a number of LEAs that have had great success with this partnership. So typically an education foundation is a 501c3 that's affiliated with the school district, and they have different ways of kind of managing and handling things that are not part of the school district. It's like working with a community-based organization. And so we know that there are LEAs that have had great success with that partnership. It's also helped them to build partnerships in other areas to support their children and youth experiencing homelessness. So just wanted to offer that as another idea. I echo what Erin said. I love this idea about partnering with United Way and contracting with them. Also want to offer contracts with your local education foundations.
And I'll just say that in case this is for any contract that needs to be amended or executed or purchase order before September 30th, sometimes it's helpful not to reinvent the wheel. So we do have on our website a section where there are sample MOUs and sample purchase orders and those sorts of things. So just would refer you to that if you want to look and just copy paste, change the names and the amounts and the dates.
These are such great questions. I want to read an example that came in the chat in response to the restaurant gift card question. One participant shared that for unaccompanied homeless youth, they have provided 2 $10 McDonald's cards, and in the middle of the week would ask if the student has used all of those funds. And then based on the student's response, that would guide this person, this liaison, on when to provide additional food cards. So that's certainly one example, and probably feasible if you have a smaller, more manageable amount of students in your district. And I saw Karen come off mute.
I just wanted to add that another thing that you could consider doing with those restaurant cards is looking at your students that might be part of sports teams and the traveling teams. And we know that many times our students who travel with their sports teams or their other activities, they often stop for dinner or meals at places along the way in their travels. So thinking through ways that maybe you can partner with the coach or the advisor of that team or club or group and have those restaurant cards available for students who are experiencing homelessness and also participating in those activities or sports.
Great. Thank you so much for adding that. Our next question came in. Do you have to have receipts for the food cards to show how the student used them? That, again, depends upon your district and whatever your local process and procedure is. Certainly, we've spoken with and worked with some districts who do require receipts to be turned in. Others do not. Others require a simple tracking form that notes how much was on the gift card, who received it, like a name, and if and when it was used. So encourage you to check with your district finance office to see what the requirements are for tracking internally. We have some examples on our website as well. There are lots of different kinds of spreadsheets that districts have used, again, to track those and to keep track of how much of the budget is remaining and can be spent towards those gift card, those store cards or restaurant cards. And I see a question that has come in the chat that says, are you able to provide the link to the sample purchase orders? I'm a new liaison and a bit overwhelmed with all of this new information. We are more than happy to provide those links in the chat. And please don't be overwhelmed. We actually do have a new liaison webpage. And so we can share that link as well, that will hopefully walk you through some things that are useful to know and need to know, but step by step and in small chunks. So we'll provide those links for you for sure. And encourage our audience, if you have examples that you use in your district. Again, we never want to reinvent the wheel. And so any resources you're willing and able to share would be helpful as well. We have a few minutes left, so I'll give us a pause to see if there are any additional questions. I see another example came in the chat. For our district, we have to document in a log the student's first and last name, then their school ID number, along with the number of store cards that they receive. So that's another example of how one district handles the distribution process for some of those cards. And then this person shared, we also document in our ARIES program, their student information system. You might use PowerSchool or another, it might have another name, but that's the student information system. Let me see if my colleagues, our schoolhouse team, have any other thoughts, revelations, or encouragement for our audience here today.
I just want to add one other thing about store cards and the food cards. I love the idea of using that to meet student needs. I think that's really important. And I want to just encourage you that in your conversations with your business offices and kind of figuring out how to track and manage all of that, just a reminder that we want to make sure that we're not creating barriers for students in all of that. And so you all as liaisons know that, but just to give you that encouragement as you talk to your business offices, to not be afraid to say that we are required to make sure that we are not creating more barriers for students as we attempt to meet those needs. So just wanted to add that.
And there was also someone was looking for, like, how do I persuade, my supervisor, people, the idea of store cards is scary for some school finance officers, others who haven't done it before. How do you kind of make the case for it? So there were some great responses from other members of this audience. But I think too, like, we're talking about the why, like this is directly related to attendance. It is directly related to engagement. It is directly related to a success. The conversation on chronic absence right now in most schools may or not be picking up on students who are experiencing homelessness. So when we are able to gain trust and engage and help actually remove a barrier to coming to school every day in a way that actually empowers families and youth, it's a real win. So we can leverage it that way. And I don't know if that'll be enough, but that's what we've been hearing from many liaisons who've been able to successfully use store cards.
And I think we've had a few additional questions come in, so I want to make sure that I'm getting to those. And thank you, Anna Sophia, for sharing that link to our very special store cards webinar that we did a few weeks ago. So if you have more questions or need more examples, we had a whole webinar dedicated to that. And so that link is in the chat. A couple additional questions. I'm wondering if I can have a school gift card for extracurricular activity fees to pre-buy those, to prepay store cards. So I'm wondering, I think I may have one or two follow-up questions. So if you're able to type more information, but I'm wondering if you mean store cards that students would take with them on for extracurricular activities to purchase things like food, or if there are extracurricular activities that require a fee, which you could certainly use funds to pay for. But if there's any additional information you can share on what those store cards for extracurricular activity fees would be, then that would be helpful. But again, in general, you can certainly use your ARP-HCY and or EHCY funds if you receive those to pay for those extracurricular activity fees. And team, I don't know if you have anything else to add. Okay. All right, our next question. We have encouraged liaisons to create family welcome centers where there is privacy to have conversations, can get materials on local services and referrals, a table and chairs for adults with another one for littles with toys and books to keep them busy while parents are talking with liaisons. It's a great use of funds. I love that example. That is so great. It warms my heart to see that you're thinking about younger siblings who might not be school aged yet, that you're creating ways to link families to other local community services and make those referrals. That's an awesome idea. And that is certainly something, the cost of a table and chairs and a privacy curtain could certainly use some of your ARP-HCY funds between now and the end of September to make that happen in your space wherever you are. So that's a great idea. Thank you so much for sharing that. I see another question here that says, our schools waive fees for McKinney-Vento students. Can we reimburse to the schools using an invoice system? This is an interesting question, and I'm assuming, let's see. So I'm assuming you are at a district and your individual schools are the ones waiving the fees. And so you're asking if you can use your ARP-HCY funds to reimburse the schools using an invoice system. I'm going to open it up to our team for this one.
I think for this, it depends on how your business office kind of manages those fees. I'm not sure I have a great answer to this question. I would talk with your business office about this. Again, school fees are allowable. We want to make sure that our students have access to participate in all of their classes and their extracurricular activities. But I would work with your business office to talk through how that invoicing system might work.
Okay, I'm going to give it another minute or so. If there are any additional questions, we are still on and happy to receive those and hear those. And I see in the chat, someone asked, did you all say there is a sample purchase order for providing funds to an outside agency to provide services as needed with appropriate documentation? And you can see, thank you, Anna Sophia shared the link there to our sample MOUs that are on our webpage, on our ARP-HCY page. So hopefully, if you need one of those sample forms, hopefully what you're looking for is there. If not, please feel free to reach out. We would love to hear what you're attempting to do in your district and what you need in order to make that happen in the next couple of weeks. And we probably know someone who's done it somewhere else and can send you some resources to help wherever you are. I'm going to turn us towards closing here and encourage you again, keep submitting questions if you have them. Our team is happy to stay on for a few minutes. And like Barbara mentioned, we have been posting the Q&As from these webinars. And so we'll collect these anonymously, of course, and share them out with the general public so that other folks can hear your great ideas. Some resources that you might want to be aware of. And again, these are hyperlinked in the PowerPoint, which we shared in the chat earlier. These are our ARP-HCY resources. You can see just our general overview on allowable uses, the Q&As from that last webinar in August, excuse me, a link to that timeline document that we shared at the start of today's webinar. Some other important clarifications from the U.S. Department of Education about allowable uses of funds during and beyond liquidation, how to maximize. So those slides that Karen and Anna Sophia went through, we have even more strategies and categories that might be useful to you. Again, depending upon if you have a little, a lot, or a medium-sized amount of funds to use. And then, of course, the link to our sample forms, MOUs, and other district examples. Our maximizing document, like I said, has a lot of different categories. Some that also might be interesting to you are things like training and professional development that you can use your funds for, emergency short-term housing. I know we had a few questions about motels and hotels, college prep access and transition, and then of course early childhood, our younger siblings who are not yet school aged. So I encourage you to check out that maximizing resource. Today we selected the categories that felt most doable in the next 24 days, but you might have a way in your district to tap into funds for these other categories as well. And then this is us. And we encourage you to reach out with any additional questions that you might have, any additional support that you might need on ARP-HCY. This PowerPoint, I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to reshare the link to the PowerPoint in the chat before people log off today. I think there's a huge need for that. And you'll also receive it in an automatic follow-up email that will come either end of day today or tomorrow. That follow-up email also has a survey just to help us better understand if this met your needs. And so we encourage you to fill out that survey. Really quickly, I want to address this question that just came in. Can we use ARP funds to pay for room rental fees to host professional developments for the McKinney-Vento liaisons? I think yes, any cost associated with professional development for McKinney-Vento and to benefit students experiencing homelessness can be covered with ARP-HCY funds. Our team has been at trainings where ARP-HCY funds were used to cover the room cost, the food, make sure you feed people well, and you can use your ARP-HCY funds to do that. Any supplies that are needed for that training, certainly tap into your ARP-HCY funds as long as that training is about McKinney-Vento and supporting our students experiencing homelessness. And we did link to the PowerPoint in the chat. I think you got it a couple more times there at the end. So we want to make sure you have access to that. And with that, I will say thank you to our schoolhouse team. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We just have the utmost appreciation for everything you do to support our students and families experiencing homelessness. And we want to be here as a resource to help you. So please don't hesitate to reach out, and we hope to see you on a webinar again soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.